September 16th, 1992, London. Inside the Bank of England, men in dark suits stare at screens that will not stop falling. The British pound is collapsing, and no matter how much money they spend, they cannot stop it. By sunset, the British government will surrender and pull its currency out of the European system entirely. 3,000 miles away, in a Manhattan office, one man will walk away with $1 billion. This is the story of George Soros and the trade that broke the Bank of England. To understand how one man could stand against an entire country, you have to go back almost 50 years before that day in London. To a boy in a city that was about to be destroyed. George Soros was born in 1930 in Budapest into a Jewish family. His father, Tivadar, was a quiet, brilliant lawyer who had survived a prisoner of war camp during the Russian Revolution. Tivadar had learned, in that camp, how to read a dangerous world. When systems collapse, the survivors are the ones who see the collapse coming first. In March 1944, when George was 13, that lesson came home. Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. Within months, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews would be deported. Most would never return. But Tivadar moved fast. He bought false identity papers, he arranged hiding places, he helped neighbors and strangers do the same. Young George spent the war pretending to be the godson of a Hungarian government official. A different name, a different church. He learned very early that identity itself could mean the difference between life and death. Years later, he would describe 1944 as the most formative year of his life. Not because of the fear, because of what he watched his father do. Tivadar gave his son a single, lifelong belief. The world is not stable. All systems break eventually, and the people who survive are the ones who see the cracks first. That belief would later be worth $1 billion. After the war, Hungary fell under Soviet control. In 1947, at 17, Soros left Budapest for London. He had almost no money. He worked as a railway porter, carrying suitcases through London stations. He worked as a waiter in a nightclub. And in his spare time, he studied at the London School of Economics. There, he met the man who would change his thinking forever. His name was Karl Popper. Popper was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He had escaped fascism in Austria years earlier, and he taught his students one simple, dangerous idea. No one ever truly knows the truth. Every theory we have about the world is incomplete. Every certainty we hold can be wrong. A wise person, Popper said, is not the one who is sure. The wise person is the one who keeps watching for the moment their own ideas break apart. To Soros, this was not just philosophy. It was the same lesson his father had taught him in occupied Budapest. Systems are never as stable as they look. The smart person watches for the cracks. Soros wanted to become a great philosopher, but philosophy did not pay rent. So in 1956, he moved to New York and took a job on Wall Street. He never stopped thinking like a philosopher. He just turned that mind onto money. Through the 1960s and 70s, while building a career as a trader, Soros was quietly working on his own theory of how markets actually behave. Most economists at the time believed that markets are rational, that prices reflect all available information, that, given enough time, the market always finds the correct value of the thing. Soros believed this was nonsense. He had watched his father read a collapsing society in 1944. He had studied with a philosopher who taught that no one ever sees the full picture. And on Wall Street, he had watched grown men make catastrophic decisions because they all believed the same wrong thing at the same time. Markets, Soros argued, are not rational. They are made of people, and people see the world incorrectly all the time. Soros gave his theory a name: reflexivity. The idea is simpler than it sounds. When investors believe a price will go up, they buy. Their buying actually pushes the price up. The rising price then convinces more investors that the original belief was correct, so they buy too. The price keeps climbing, not because the underlying value has changed, but because belief is feeding on itself. Then the same thing happens in reverse. When investors begin to fear that something is overvalued, they sell. The price falls. The falling price convinces more people that something is wrong. The selling becomes a stampede. Markets, Soros said, are mirrors. They reflect what people believe, and then those beliefs reshape reality itself. In Soros's hands, this idea became a weapon. Because if you understand that markets move on belief, you also understand something dangerous. When a system is built on a false belief, a belief the market itself is starting to question, that system can be pushed. In 1992, Soros found such a system. It was called the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, and it was sitting on a fault line. Can understand what was about to happen, you have to understand what the European Exchange Rate Mechanism actually was. After the Second World War, European countries wanted a continent that worked together, shared markets, eventually a shared currency. So in 1979, they created the ERM, an agreement that locked European currencies into a narrow range against each other. If a currency drifted too far, the country's central bank, the institution that issues the money, was required to step in and pull it back. Think of it as a system of ropes tied between ships. The ships could rise and fall a little with the waves, but they could not drift apart. The strongest ship in the fleet was the German mark. Every other currency in the system, in effect, was tied to it. In 1990, Britain decided to join the system. It was a controversial decision. Many British economists believed the pound was being locked in at too high a rate, but the British government insisted. Joining the ERM was a matter of national pride. Then came German reunification. When East Germany merged with West Germany, the German government had to spend enormous sums of money to rebuild the East, and to control the inflation, the Bundesbank kept German interest rates high. And here is where the trap closed. Because Britain was tied to the mark, Britain had to keep its own interest rates high too. Otherwise, investors would dump pounds and buy marks, and the pound would fall out of the ERM ban. But Britain was already in a recession. Businesses were struggling. Homeowners were drowning under mortgage payments. The country desperately needed lower interest rates. The British government was caught between two impossible choices: cut rates and break the ERM, or hold rates and let the country sink. And one man in New York was watching very, very carefully. By the summer of 1992, George Soros was 62 years old. He ran a hedge fund called the Quantum Fund, a private investment firm for very wealthy clients, designed to make large, concentrated bets on global events. And next to him sat a man named Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller was almost 20 years younger than Soros. He had grown up in middle-class Pittsburgh and worked his way up from a trainee at a regional bank to become one of the most respected analysts in finance. Soros had hired him in 1988 to be the lead manager of the Quantum Fund. The deal was simple. Druckenmiller did the deep research. Soros judged the size of the bet. Through 1992, Druckenmiller had been studying the British pound. The numbers told him something the British government did not want to admit. The pound was overvalued. British inflation was running roughly 3 times the German rate. The Bank of England was already spending huge amounts of money buying pounds in the open market just to keep the currency from falling out of the ERM band. To Druckenmiller, the situation looked like a man holding a heavy stone above his head with arms that were already shaking. Sooner or later, the arms would fail. So Druckenmiller began shorting the pound, borrowing pounds, selling them on the open market, planning to buy them back later at a lower price. The difference would be his profit. Short selling, in plain language, is a bet that something will go down. You profit when the price falls. By August 1992, Druckenmiller had built up a position worth around $1.5 billion, a very large bet. But he was patient, waiting for the catalyst that would make the pressure on the pound impossible to hold back. That catalyst came on the evening of September 15th. On the evening of September 15th, 1992, a small story appeared in a German financial newspaper. It was a quote from Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the Bundesbank, the most powerful central banker in Europe. In an interview, Schlesinger had suggested that some currencies in the ERM might need to be devalued, meaning simply to officially lower their value against other currencies. Schlesinger later claimed he had been speaking off the record, that his remarks had been misunderstood. It did not matter. The quote was already circulating around the world. In the Quantum Fund's offices in Manhattan, Stanley Druckenmiller saw the report and understood instantly what it meant. The most powerful central banker in Europe had just publicly suggested European currencies were misaligned. The pressure on the pound was about to become unbearable. Druckenmiller went to find Soros. He told him their existing $1.5 billion bet was about to pay off and suggested they consider adding to the position. Soros looked at him and gave him an answer that would become legendary in financial history. Soros said, "If the news is real and there is almost no downside, why are we only doing $1.5 billion? Why aren't we doing $15 billion?" He told Druckenmiller, "Go for the jugular." What Soros was demanding was almost reckless. That the entire fund, that more than the entire fund, borrow against everything they had and use all of it to push against the pound. This was reflexivity in action. The theory Soros had spent 40 years developing was now being weaponized in real time. A massive short position would push the pound down hard. The falling price would convince other traders the pound was finished. They would join the selling. Belief would feed on itself. The system would crack. That night, while Europe slept, the Quantum Fund began selling pounds on a scale the markets had never seen before. By the time London opened the next morning, the fund's position would exceed $10 billion. September 16th, 1992, Wednesday. In London, the Bank of England opened its doors to a market that was already in chaos. The pound was falling fast. The Bank of England started buying pounds to prop it up. By 8:40 in the morning, it had spent £1 billion. The market absorbed the billion and kept selling. Other hedge funds, watching the carnage, joined Soros and Druckenmiller in shorting the pound. By mid-morning, the British government realized buying a loan was not going to work, so they raised interest rates. At 11 a.m., the Bank of England raised its base rate from 10% to 12%. Higher rates would make holding pounds more attractive. Investors would rush back to earn the higher return. The market did not flinch. The selling continued. At 2 p.m., in a move that bordered on panic, rates were raised again, from 12% to 15% in a single day, in a country already deep in recession. It was a public confession that the situation was out of control. And still, the pound kept falling. Every trader in the world understood. The British government was bluffing. No British economy could survive 15% rates. The only thing keeping the pound in the ERM was political will. And political will was no longer enough. At 7:40 in the evening, Chancellor Norman Lamont stepped before the cameras outside the Treasury. He announced that the United Kingdom was suspending its membership of the exchange rate mechanism. In plain language, Britain had given up. The pound would no longer be tied to the European system. Within hours, the pound dropped 15% against the German mark. The Bank of England had spent an estimated 40% of its foreign currency reserves in a single day. And it had failed. In Manhattan, in the Quantum Fund's offices, the numbers came in slowly through the evening. Soros and Druckenmiller had made over $1 billion in a single day. The British government had spent more than £3 billion defending a price it could not hold. And George Soros, the boy who had survived occupied Budapest, the philosopher who had spent 40 years thinking about how systems break, had his name printed in newspapers around the world the next morning. The man who broke the Bank of England. In the days after Black Wednesday, the British public was furious. The Conservative government's reputation for economic competence collapsed almost overnight. 5 years later, that same government would suffer a historic electoral defeat. Many historians believe Black Wednesday was the wound that never healed. And yet, in the years that followed, freed from the ERM, the British pound found its natural level. Exports became more competitive. Interest rates came down. The economy began to recover. Some British politicians, quietly, began calling that day not Black Wednesday, but White Wednesday. The day Britain was forced out of a system it should never have joined. History, it seems, can change its mind. As for Soros, the trade made him a household name. He went on to give away tens of billions of dollars over the following decades to scholarships, universities, and organizations promoting open democratic societies, the very ideas his old teacher Karl Popper had built his life around. Stanley Druckenmiller would manage the Quantum Fund for another 8 years, then build his own fortune. To this day, when asked about Black Wednesday, Druckenmiller credits Soros with one thing: the audacity to push when others would have held back. The deeper lesson of Black Wednesday is not really about currencies or hedge funds or central banks. It is about something older. Every system that humans build is held together by belief, by the trust that something will hold, by the assumption that the rules will not break. And every once in a while, someone studies that system carefully enough to see the cracks first. Someone who understands that confidence, the confidence of governments, of markets, of nations, is itself a fragile thing. Soros did not destroy the British economy. He saw a fault line that was already there, and he pushed. That makes him a financial genius or a man who profited from a country's pain? That is a question people have argued about for more than 30 years. And maybe always will. But this much is certain. Some empires don't fall to enemies. They fall to the moment when the world stops believing in them. Every fortune has a price. What do you think? Was Soros a brilliant strategist who simply read the world more clearly than everyone else? Or did he profit from the pain of an entire country? I tried to tell this story without taking sides, but I'd love to hear your answer in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Golden Ruin. Every Friday, we tell another one, the financial moves that shaped history and the men who paid the price. I'll see you next week.